Thanks, Laura.
Mr. Keating, you said before that that China has not threatened Australia, but how do you reconcile that with the fact that they have issued sanctions on coal, timber, wine, lobster, barley, Australian products, that there has been a huge military ramp-up that Laura's asked you about?
The threat to Australia is a military threat, right? A military threat. It's a threat for the army of the People's Republic of China to come and occupy Australia. That's what a threat is. Like, for instance, a similar threat would be if someone went to occupy Tasmania on us, right? That's what a threat is. Commercial reactions on things like the things you mentioned, they're not strategic. They're not in a threat. You know, I mean, look at what we're doing to them in the WTO and all the steel dumping and all the rest of our stuff. You know, I mean, you know, in the friction of international politics, these things turn up, but they're not threats. You can't impute threat meaning invasion with putting a tariff on wine. Or maybe you're silly enough to think that. You know, do you think you are silly enough to think that?
Mr. Keating, cyber attack.
Well, what do you think? The Americans and the Russians are not into cyber attacks? Who in the world is not into cyber attacks? Or do you think we are not? You know, just remember this. The best friend we had in Asia was a former president of Indonesia, Batu, Yudhoyono. You know, he was the best guy we had barracking for us. You know, those dopes in ACES tapped his telephone and that of his wife. Tapped his phone. I mean, this is what states get up to if you let these security agencies, ning-nongs, take control, you know. But you can't impute, as your question imputes, that a tax or a tariff on wine or barley is equivalent to an invasion of the country. China does not threaten Australia, has not threatened Australia, does not intend to threaten Australia. You can have all these commercial rows you like. We can have diplomatic sort of dust. Remember, this all happened. It was out of that came all of this, you know. So you can't put a question without contexting it. Like, you know, I mean, contextualisation may not be your long suit, but that's what you should be doing.
Olivia Casely from Sky News.
Olivia Casely from Sky News. You've described Foreign Minister Penny Wong and Defence Minister Richard Marles as seriously unwise in this 9-page document. Unlike present players, you haven't received a military briefing on this issue since the mid-90s. What makes you so sure China isn't a military threat to Australia?
Because I've got a brain, principally, and I can think, and I can read, you know, and I read every day, you know. I mean, why would China want a threat? What would be the point? They get the iron ore, the coal, the wheat. What would be the point of China wanting to occupy Sydney and Melbourne militarily? And could they ever do it? I mean, could they ever bring the numbers here? It would be an armada of troop ships to do it, you know. So you don't need a briefing from the dopey security agency we have in Canberra to tell you that, you know. I mean, I know you're trying to ask a question, but the question is so dumb it's hardly worth an answer.
Well, so do you just let them carry on with their business, whether that be in the Spratly Islands or wherever, you just say, oh, well, they don't plan to attack Australia, so it's all okay?
You know how big what's the other islands we're always talking about? Just look, just pick it up, just go on to Google Maps and have a look at it. It's about as big as Centennial Park, about as large as Centennial Park in Sydney. That's what we're talking about here. You know, I mean, you know, Sky News, you got to dust up your reputation to be on Sky News, you know, and you're probably doing your best to do that.
Thank you.
Ben Westcott from Bloomberg.
Thank you very much for your talk, Mr. Keating. Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. I just wanted to ask, you talked a lot about orthodox threats, that being an invasion of Australia, but as my colleagues have said up here, there are many other different types of threats, and particularly for Australia, we're a trading nation. All of our wealth comes in large part from overseas trade, and that's similarly to the US interest in Asia. A lot of their trade comes from Asia as well. Shouldn't Australia work with a partner like the US to protect trade, which is its main economic interest in the region?
This is the United States that would never ever agree at congressional level to ratify the international program on the law of the sea. You realise that, don't you? The US refused to ratify the law of the sea program, right? So that puts a pretty big hole through that question, doesn't it? Secondly, why would the Chinese can't find an alternative supply to Australian iron ore? They've got 30% of their country still to build. We have the highest grade, 63% Fe iron ore, 10 steaming days from their coast. What, do you think they don't want that? You think we need the American military at the Pentagon to make sure our iron ore boats go to China? The Chinese, it's a wonder they don't have a welcome for us out every day one of these damn things turns up, because all that tonnage on their wharves build these Chinese cities. The story of modern China is a story of urbanisation. That's what it is. Urban areas are built with steel. Steel can only be done in China out of Australia. So why would the Chinese want to interrupt their capacity to deal with us? Why would we see some donkey in Washington to help us?
Matthew Knott from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age.
I do have a backup question. I do have a question on China. China's submarine fleet is forecast to grow by 6 nuclear-powered submarines by 2030, and they're building 20 service warships a year, which is even more than the entire Australian fleet. In your opinion, who is being more provocative, Australia or China?
What the Chinese do in the building of fleet is not provocation. Why do you use the word provocation? That's the wrong word to be using. They're a major state. They have an economy bigger than the United States. They spend about 40% of their national budget on defence. The Americans spend more than the next 9 states in the world on defence. So why is it a provocation? Why would you think it's a provocation for a great state like China to build a navy? Why would you think that? I mean, I just don't accept it. The question's invalid. That's the truth of it,
Thank you.
Matthew Knott from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age has a question.
Hi, Mr. Keating. I'll ask 2 parts if I could. You've been extremely critical today of the Albanese government, including Ministers Richard Marles and Penny Wong. Are you concerned that your comments today could represent a fundamental rupture with the party? You've already said that the Prime Minister hasn't responded to your request to brief him on this. And secondly, you have a tremendous skill for invective and criticism. Could I ask you now to turn some of that to will you be similarly critical of them as you are of people in your own party and journalists?
After what you co-wrote with Hartcher last week in that shocking presentation in the Herald on Monday, Tuesday, and when you should hang your head in shame. I'm surprised you even have the gall to stand up in public and ask such a question, frankly. You ought to do the right thing and drum yourself out of Australian journalism, I mean, that's the most egregious, the worst, the most biased presentation. You pick up 4 specialists. You could have picked up John McCarthy, a long-term specialist, Alan Gingell. You pick up 4 China hawks, the biggest of them all, Jennings, Davina Lee. These are all China hawks. You represent them to your community as having an independent view, where you know full well that you've selected them to do this thing. And here you are asking me about Uyghurs, and you're asking me about, if I said to you, and I did say when I saw it last time, here's the Prime Minister over, there's everyone over to India, not one question from any one of you about Modi shutting in the Muslims in Kashmir, in the pro-Hindu policies. Nothing.
But there is still a question, Mr. Keating, about the treatment of the Uyghurs.
One thing we can't be sure of, what if the Chinese said, but look, What about deaths in custody of Aboriginal people in your prison system? You know, wouldn't that be a valid point for them? Wouldn't it be a valid point? In other words, great power diplomacy cannot be about reaching down into the low social entrails of these states any more than they can with us. You know, but the Sydney Morning Herald, frankly, has lost. It's a newspaper without integrity, and the Age follows it in. Poor little, like a little pup running behind. You know, I mean, if I were you, mate, I'd hide my face and never appear again.